why are African Americans so angry? I'm sure you would have seen the video, or I should say the title of this video, and that probably would have had a few of you offended. So my apologies, but I have to find a way to get you guys to actually interact with this. So first and foremost, just some disclaimers. I'm of West African heritage with a British accent, so it's obvious that I'm from the UK. Um, this is meant to be, in my opinion, a way to just kind of get my thoughts out and to just consider and think about certain things. It's not necessarily a New Year's resolution. I started off writing an essay, and then I realized that I just couldn't be asked to sit down and actually do the typing out and thinking it through and writing it again and again and again before eventually posting it somewhere, whether that be Substack or something. So I've decided to do this instead. This is completely off the top of my head. It's not researched in any great detail. So although you could eviscerate me because essentially there is no um, indication, there is no obligation for you to be nice. I would just say that understand is in the spirit of almost just thinking about things and thinking it through, but also just inviting people to have a conversation. That being said, I think um, the main topic of conversation for me on this particular issue is understanding why it is there's a schism between African Americans and Africans, specifically in terms of what's been going on social media and on Twitter. And I think essentially it's this weird thing where, for example, you have African Americans who are now calling themselves foundational Black American, for example, and then calling Africans or immigrant Africans or immigrant Black people as tethers, which does have a negative connotation to it, and perhaps understandably so. Um, and ultimately, there's this weird sense, again, that Africans, from the continent, don't like African Americans, and also the assumption is also that African Americans don't like Africans, which I think is untrue, and I think is incorrect, and I think is wrong. Um, so why, like, what do I think the issue is? What do I think the problem is? How do I think we can move forward? In terms of what I think the problem is or what I think the issue is, I think ultimately a lot of um, a lot of Black people in the world don't fully appreciate what African Americans have had to go through, and equally, I think a lot of African Americans don't really appreciate, what Africans have had to go through. If you look at the breakdown of, the African American experience, starting from slavery, you have that lasting until the 1800s, for about 200, 300 years. And then you have another 100 years of segregation where you have African Americans essentially being treated as second class citizens, being told legally that you deserve less, you are less. And then this ending only in the 1960s. Um, and it only ended with this kind of um, climactic moment of, their preeminent leaders being assassinated in front of their eyes, whether that be Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, Fred Hampton, and so on, right? And then you move into the 1970s, and essentially that was characterized with this integration effort. Yes, segregation is now legally over, but it would not have been an easy transition for African Americans to go into, you know, um, integrating into society. And when I say it wouldn't be easy, frankly speaking, I mean that racism would have still persisted even though legally it was no longer allowed, and it would still persist even in environments where legal where it was like government buildings, for example, those would still perpetuate a certain level of racism. Um, and then you go into the 1980s with the crack epidemic, right? And then this we now know was, the hand of the CIA, um, shipping drugs into the black community and neighborhood and people of color, being the ones most affected by it. And then you go on to the war on drugs with which was the 90s and into the early 2000s, where you have African Americans essentially being told, you guys are drug addicts, you're drug dealers, you're worth nothing. So you watch in real time African American households being broken apart, decimated essentially because the government already was responsible for pumping drugs into these neighborhoods, is now turning around and taking them and putting them in for-profit organizations to serve out ridiculously long prison sentences for legal infractions that in effect were predatory in nature to begin with, because you're the ones giving them the drugs. And so when you have all of that happening, in terms of the Black African American experience, and then on top of that you have this issue of being told, well, racism is not legal. So yes, we used to have racism in this country, but it's over now because it's illegal. And essentially telling them that when it comes down to it, um, you, you shouldn't really feel any sort of issues, because um, anyone who has any sort of business mentality or business acumen knows that you choose people based on merit. So it would be wrong for me to discriminate or choose somebody, or choose somebody else just because the best person might be black, which we know is not true. So the backdrop being racism, segregation, integration into segregation, uh, uh, um, and then integration post segregation, I should say, and then having to deal with the crack epidemic, war on drugs, and then now you're being told, oh, whatever you're thinking about racism and being subjugated is, you're just thinking it, it's in your head. Like there's nothing, like just get over it. The laws have made it clear that you deserve equal rights, and so on and so forth. And so African Americans essentially deal with this constant gaslighting of, we're saying that this is an issue, no one's listening. We're saying it's an issue, no one's listening. And then eventually, when things go wrong, like horribly wrong, then all of a sudden everyone's like, oh, I guess, and that's not even without going into, the more recent atrocities that have happened in the last 20 years, with the assassination of multiple different, or killing of multiple different black people, leading to the Black Lives Matter movement. The conversations about the Lives Matter organization, or BLM organization, is entirely a different conversation. But I think that doesn't take away from the fact that these individuals who went out there to campaign for black rights were doing it for a specific reason, and this can be tied again back to not just this moment of black people getting killed by police officers and now being digitized for people to see. You're also seeing issues of black people having to deal with the crack epidemic, having to deal with integrating into segregation, and before that living in segregation, and before that being slaves and being descendants of slaves. All of this can be traced all the way back to when the first ship landed in the US. And so there's a significant amount of trauma, and there's been a significant amount of work, there's been a significant amount of bloodshed for African Americans to be where they are today. And so I think that's one thing a lot of black people in the West, sorry, black people outside of the West, or black people who aren't African Americans, don't fully appreciate when it comes to the struggles of the average African American individual. Um, but then, on the flip side, you look at Africa, you look at the African continent, you know, and essentially what you see is Africans today living in an environment where it's basically due to colonialism. You take a country, for example, like Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe came into fruition as a nation in 1980. It had a president and a prime minister, if I'm not mistaken. I can't remember the name of the president, but the prime minister's name was Robert Mugabe, and that's going to become relevant shortly. Um, and so imagine in 1980, Robert Mugabe was the prime minister of Zimbabwe. In 1987, he takes power. He doesn't leave his position of power until 2017. So since their independence, and since Zimbabwe became a country recognized as a nation, it's only had, you could say, less than three presidents, right? Um, uh, and God knows how much in terms of corruption has occurred when it comes to the amounts of money that was stolen by those individuals in a position of power. Or, for example, you take a country like Gabon. A famous leader by the name of Omar Bongo. He was in a position of power similarly to Robert Mugabe for like 30 years, and died in the late 2000s, 2020, like maybe 2016, 2017. I can't remember specifically when. But when he died, they found that he had somewhere in the region of like $200 million worth of assets. Some in cash in Swiss banks, and in you know suburban homes in Paris. And Gabon is a wealthy nation. And so when you look at it from that perspective and you look at, the effects of colonialism, what essentially happened was this. You had countries that were largely colonized by the UK, France, Portugal, Spain, but mainly the UK and France. When these countries started gaining their independence following the end of the Second World War, and the reason why that Second World War is relevant is because, these colonial powers did not give up control over these nations because of their, goodness of their heart. They did it because essentially they knew that, look, we can't administer, we can't continue with the, holding on to the administrative burden of looking after these colonial of these, colonies that we own. So we have to give them their independence. And so you see a lot of countries, from the 1940s onwards, excluding a few exceptions, who got their independence, following the 1940s, following on from the 1940s and the end of the Second World War, right? And so once these countries have now gained their independence from these colonial powers, there's a power vacuum, number one. And number two, a lot of these countries were initially colonized because they had natural resources that could be exploited. And those natural resources weren't necessarily entirely finished. They were still there. And so essentially what happened was you had these countries who were former colonial powers over these now independent countries. But then you have now multinational corporations going into these African countries and then basically taking, in many ways, the place of the colonial powers. And essentially, you can look it up online, and what you'll see is a lot of these companies will go into these countries, and they'll essentially just sponsor, you know, a politician, and that politician will just go in there and for the price of $1 million or $2 million, however much they will get per year, will agree to, you know, maintain the status quo, if it's favorable to the multinational corporations, and if it's not favorable to them, these politicians essentially agree to change and to introduce policy and so on and so forth, that would make it more, you know, favorable. Another important aspect that I think a lot of people don't appreciate when it comes to the state of African culture, of African politics, is also the fact that you have, these countries now, as sovereign states, now have to deal with situations of, okay, we have to look after our GDP, we have to, we have to make sure that the country is running a certain type of way, we have to at least try. And in so doing, now you have to deal with, the World Bank and the IMF and so on. And so when you go to these organizations and you take out loans because for whatever reason, you might come short when it comes to your own budget, you're now running, you now owe these banks money. However, when you take out these loans, they come with conditions. So similar to, an average person buying a house, they're not just giving you 100, £200,000 or however much money, so that you can go and buy a house. They give you that money knowing that that money is already going to go into the purchase of a home. Like that's what it's for, and they set it up in such a way where that money doesn't ever touch your account. It goes to your lawyers or whatever, and then from there it then goes into buying the house. But that money rarely ever comes to you directly. Similarly, that's the first thing in terms of the restrictions, which is understandable. But also, there's conditions such as devaluing your currency. Now, when you devalue your currency as a nation because you know that you're taking out a loan, you're doing that because the IMF or the World Bank, I should say, believes that if you devalue your currency, you're going to encourage outside investors to come and invest into your country. Surface level makes sense. You want people to come to your country, you have to make it enticing for them to do so. But the downside is that when you do something like that, you're creating this situation where, as an African nation, you're now having outside investors who, when they're done investing and start taking profits, they're going to pay little to no tax and will find a way to make sure that every single penny of the benefits they get from these nations goes back to exactly where they came from. And so rather than the money somehow, some way being part of, bringing up these nations continue to be subjugated because it becomes beneficial to these corporations to have a political system where they have to pay the minimum amount of tax, if any, and extremely advantageous, extremely advantageous agreements, right? And it's interesting because from the outside looking in at times, when I sometimes allow myself to not necessarily look at myself as an African, but just to kind of try to remove myself from the situation and look at it, I think to myself, these organizations, if they were to, sit down and under oath and under a lie detector test, and they were asked certain questions, they would not be able to answer them without looking like absolute monsters, because of the simple fact that these are countries that these are individuals, I should say, who you can't tell me that you've been doing business in Africa for 50 years and you've not bribed anyone, or you've not, lied or stolen, or you've not cheated somebody out of a deal, even though you had a contract that said otherwise. You know, and this has happened in all the fuel rich nations, or all the resource rich nations. And I think that colonialism, followed by the negative impacts of not having a government that's well administered, leads to a situation where for the average African, you're earning $100 a month, if that, you know. And so I think on both sides, in terms of the experiences that both sides face, you can see what's happened. And the thing that connects Africa to Africa to African Americans, not just the only thing, but the one thing that connects them is the fact that Africa and today's Africans are descendants of people who lost their relatives to the slave trade. You understand? So at the same time, people were going through the trauma, millions of people were going through the trauma of taking as slaves. There were equally millions of people who were mourning the loss of their relatives, who were then taken as slaves. And so I think sometimes there's this dismissiveness on both sides, at least, from my perspective, where it's almost as if, it's easy to kind of look at Africa and say, well, it's your responsibility. You guys are the ones in a position of power. Do something about it. Whilst at the same time, Africans will look at African Americans and say, you live, what we can only look at and see as heaven. You mean to tell me you have running water and electricity never cuts out, and you can get paid $1,000 or more per month just to clean toilets. You know, I mean, like that's a dream pay for so many people. And I think because of that, there's this misunderstanding, and ultimately that's what it comes down to. And the unfortunate reality is this. The unfortunate reality is this. In Africa, we've seen how corporations and formerly um, colonial powers have dominated the African continent through um, just tribalism and exploiting that weakness. Saying, "Oh, you guys are from different tribes. Oh, okay, we just choose this one, and then we'll elevate them to a certain position. We'll give them control, and they're the minority, but we'll give them control to rule over the many, right? And then, once it falls apart, then we just move on to the next country, or we move on to the next opportunity, right? And I think what we're seeing when we look at Africans and African Americans, we're just looking at New Age tribalism. At least that's how I would coin it in my mind. Like it's New Age tribalism. This notion that we're both black, but because you're African American and I'm West African, all of a sudden I don't necessarily know, as an average West African or African, what your history is, and you don't know what my history is. And as a consequence, it kind of creates this weird sense of understanding, this weird kind of warped perception where we both don't really see each other, which is unfortunate, which is unfortunate. Um, but I think it's in many ways social engineered or social media engineered, because I think on an everyday basis when you meet people out and about, those who are West Africans and I think those who are African Americans would see each other eye to eye and would be able to interact on a normal basis. So, but yeah, that was kind of like the crux of what I was thinking. Tell me what you guys think about my thoughts and opinions, and if you guys have any red flags. But I think you know if there's anything I'd say in closing is that this is new age tribalism. We should quench it out rather than encourage it to continue, and we should be very careful about you know making sure that as individuals, before we spout opinions, we at least try to kind of go through a filtration process of making sure that we've considered, reasonably, we've considered different aspects and different positions. Unfortunately, if we continue to do what we're doing, with this headline, like screen grab type of like, just like a quick, shoot from the hip mentality, I think will cause a lot of harm. And whether it's bots or whether it's genuine, legitimate powers that are trying to cause strife and split within the black community, I think that's going to continue to happen. Um, and I guess as much as I believe that African Americans have 100% a right, to put out their chest in terms of what they were able to do so that they can actually live as citizens in the United States of America. I also think that, going about it in a way where you're looking at West Africans or Black immigrants and saying, just by virtue of the fact that you come from a different background or you come from a different culture, all of a sudden, I'm going to differentiate, I'm going to treat you differently. I think that's a very dangerous path to take. And I think, ultimately, if it continues, people will pay the price. I'm somebody who believes, I have a certain sense of optimism when it comes to the world, but at the same time, I believe that when the chips are down, prison rules apply. And when that's the case, you look for your fellow black men, regardless of where they come from, as long as they're not, one of those people that align themselves with, the other side, and you sit with them. I'm not talking about a race war, by the way. I mean in the sense of, when society starts to fall apart, oftentimes it's people look for other people that look like them. And I think if that were ever to happen in terms of a schism in the US, I think it would harm black people if they allowed separatist mentality or tribalistic mentality to take hold. You know, um, yeah, there's more that brings us together than separates us or differentiates us, and I think that should be focused on. But I do think also that yes, from time to time, it's more than necessary to check, immigrants, people of color who are immigrants coming into the nation, into the United States of America, who might not necessarily have a full appreciation for African American history and what African American people have gone through. You know, most people, even me, someone who grew up in the UK, I didn't necessarily get a healthy education of African American history. I had to go on and look it up myself and read articles online and watch videos to kind of come up to a decent knowledge of what you guys have gone through. So, um, but yeah, that's about it when it comes to my thoughts. Um, just write whatever you want to write down in the comments below, and let's have a conversation about it. But be nice, be fair, be just, and yeah, thank you.